Okay, so now that we have the material set up here, just using the Rhino material palette, which is much faster, but also, of course, much simpler and much more simplistic in terms of its rendering, but can be really effective just in terms of allowing you to quickly kind of give some of the character to the building just using transparency and color. This is also going to allow for the model to render much more quickly. During this video, I'm going to pause and stop in between the rendering, but you'll notice when you start rendering anything heavy inside of Vray that it can very quickly slow you down, and we'll talk about some of the other techniques, but certainly materials is the very first way to simply speed up the rendering that you're doing. The second part is just to avoid any kind of reflectivity. The reflections and transparency are the things that most quickly start to weigh down any model that you might be working on. So firing up V-Ray now, this starts through the asset editor. These two little arrows here basically open up other variations. What you're looking at here first is the materials. I'm going to hit the left arrow and you can see that this brings up a whole subset of materials. The next one is lights. The next one is geometry. The third one is settings. And this button over here, anytime you see the teapot, that's indicating a rendering. The very first thing that was rendered computationally was a model of a teapot, as it had asymmetrical edges and nuanced kind of complex geometry. It was the test that many companies that were working on rendering techniques were using. I'm going to come back to these kind of material pieces. You can see by default that there's just a document sun that's brought into the model. The geometry is really only when you start using V-Ray geometry, which we'll talk about in a second. The settings are really where things are useful. And again, I'll hit this side arrow to open up all of the different options. Here, you really don't have to mess with a lot of this. The camera settings can provide you with a method for creating panoramas and a cube model, which just allows you to sort of look in different directions at the same object. These exposure levels, all of this stuff you can leave the same. The render output, however, is definitely a place where you want to pay attention. When you're first testing out a rendering, you want to keep this as small as possible. Usually I keep it down around 400 pixels. In the aspect ratio, you can either kind of fix or you can tell it to match the viewport. I typically match the viewport because that tends to be what I'm sort of framing as I move it around. You can leave the save image off, that way it doesn't prompt you to save the image right away. The background, you can do one of two ways. You can either kind of change the color to, I like to keep it at white. I tend to keep the ground plane and things as white. And here we're going to encounter our first map. So a bitmap basically allows you to pick any kind of an image and use it as that background. So in this instance, you probably would want to use some kind of a sky image. There are some default ones in here that I'll let you explore on your own. You can also just render or save these images as a PNG. This is what I prefer to do. If you save a PNG, the background will be transparent and you can bring it into Photoshop and align a sky image in Photoshop to match the angle or the perspective of your drawing or of your model. None of the rest of this is really useful. Swarm is used for using multiple machines. If you have multiple machines on a network, you can point their processors to help out with the rendering when you're doing really big, heavy renderings. That's useful. Ray trace, again, this is bouncing light and bouncing imagery around a model, and this affords you the ability to kind of control how accurate that ray tracing is. Global illumination is really useful just in terms of getting consistent lighting. Caustics you probably don't want to use, but again is another part of the material character. And these other two pieces down here are rarely used. If we just hit render now, we can do a quick little test rendering. And again, I'm doing this really small at first because I don't want to deal I don't want to just be sitting here staring at V-Ray. The first rule of V-Ray, I always like to say, is don't stare at V-Ray, because you're inevitably just going to sit here and watch it kind of develop the model. And even this tiny little drawing you can see is taking quite a while for it to render. There it's complete after about 20 seconds, 30 seconds for a tiny little one. You can see that the lighting is pretty consistent inside of here. There aren't any kind of controlled lights. So a couple of ways we can do that, of course, because it's the salon. The first thing that we may want to do is actually change the material of the salon roof. So I'm going to come up here and figure out what layer that's on. Let's see, it looks like it's this glazing curtain wall. So at first here, I'm just going to change this over to something slightly more transparent, but still white, just to allow for some of that light to come through. And then we'll come back and kind of adjust how we're doing that. You also notice that because there's no light in the model, there weren't any shadows being cast. I think I will go ahead and insert a light in here. So there are some other V-Ray buttons. The infinite plane is useful in basically kind of creating a plane that makes it appear as though you're in a photo studio. I'll go and add one of those. You can also create a clipping plane. This clipping plane, basically when I click it, if I zoom out, is by default sort of oriented to the infinite plane. I'm going to rotate it in this image. Let's see here. Just going to rotate it 90 degrees so that it's clipping our model. And if I move this clipping plane so that it's inside of the model, although you don't see it here in Rhino, this plane will actually be cropping the model of the building itself using this little line to indicate the direction that it's facing. So I'm going to get down in here where I might be able to observe that clipping plane working and do another test rendering to see if the lighting is any better. And here you can see that clip is clipping through some of the crit rooms. For a funny reason, the infinite plane was put on the wood layer because I had it on that layer when I clicked to actually create it. So that's causing the plane to not be white. I'm going to cancel that. Grab this infinite plane and move it over to layer 5, which is all white. Okay, so now getting back in here, what we may want to start to do is apply some more specific kinds of materials to the model from inside of V-Ray. And just while I'm talking here, I'll hit render again so you can start to see some of the character of those original kind of simple V-Ray materials that I was using. Okay, so Rhino materials that I was using. So now let's look at what we get when we start bringing in V-Ray materials. And again, you have to be very careful with this. It tends to slow things way down. The first thing that I'm going to look for is a frosted ceiling panel that we can put on the roof. So I'm going to grab that, drag it over into the scene. Now this material is in the scene. You can see it renders out an approximation of what that material looks like. I can change the opacity. Again, a lot of these things are controlled by bitmaps. You can Google to learn more about these, but these bitmaps, there aren't any applied to this glazing, but I will show you another material where they are applied. So basically, to add this onto the material here, the glazing curtain panel, I'm going to right click on this and say apply to layer, and I'm going to go look for that layer in the list here, and basically you can see that it changes here in the material list in the model. I'm also going to go find a more transparent glass, and let's see if we can apply it to this glazing, which is the windows in the model. So I'm going to go to a glazing and apply that. Let's just hit render and see what happens. You can see that these windows are entirely in one block, so I would have to explode the block and pull out the glazing in order to actually apply them correctly inside of the model. Right now the mullions themselves are also going to be transparent. You can see already that the lighting inside of the building has changed from the transparent material. If you're spending more than 20 or 30 seconds looking at rendering, you need to make it smaller. Don't waste time doing this kind of stuff. It will only frustrate you later on. You can see here that the image has slowed significantly down just with the addition of those two glass panels or two glass materials. At any point you can hit the stop button here to stop the rendering. Just by closing the window isn't going to kill it. You got to hit the stop button in order to do that correctly. And I'm going to go in and find a wood material. Actually, see if we can find some cardboard to apply. I think I'm going to try this paper. Ooh. I'll try this one. I'm going to right click on that, apply to layer. I think hex color 1. No, should be the cardboard layer. So should have looked at that first. There's cardboard. And then let's bring in some more playful materials here. So these emissive ones can be really useful creating kind of like LED colors. And just to show what that looks like, I will apply that to replace the cardboard on hex color 1. And now when we hit render, you're going to see that those panels glow like lights inside of the model. Okay, so then I want to just address lighting a little bit, and the lights that you use inside of Vray are basically done one of two ways. You can come up here to the drop down. I almost only ever use a point light, and I will show you why. Basically because it keeps everything really simple. It gets it acting so that the shadows are not incredibly complex. I'm just going to use a move vertical and move this light up in the air. And then I'm going to go back into the asset thing here. Now you can see that Vray Omni light is in here. The options that I almost always use for this are to switch it over to a linear light. It's much easier to control. But when it's linear in terms of how it faults off, you need to turn it way down. By default it's set to 30. I'm going to turn this back down to 2. And first I'll do a quick rendering out here just so you can see the impact on the model. It's blown out quite a bit, and you can see it's still cropping the model based on that infinite plane. So I would probably go in and turn the intensity down on this again, but because I'm really focused on the inside of the model, and you can see how much quicker that went when we're on the outside and not dealing with all of the direct bounces from the glazing. But now with this emissive light, you're seeing that I'm getting light leaking in around the mullions. I'm getting a different set of shadows. I'm even getting some iridescence off of the blue panels of the emissive color that I applied to some of those hex panels. Lastly, maybe I'll go in and apply wood material to this. I'm going to click this across, come down here to wood, and I want to do this just to show you some of the other options that kind of come with dealing with wood. I think I'll just take this wood planks one. I drag it over again and then right click, apply to layer wood. And you can see again, if you label your layers correctly, it makes this so much easier to control in terms of how the materials come across. And I'm going to zoom in here a little bit tighter now and see if we can see some of the detail that's happening in our model. And I'll go ahead on this one and adjust the size up a little bit, again by coming here to the render output, and I'll hit 800. You can see it continues to match the viewport, and then hit the render. Now we can at least visualize some of the character of these materials. You can see here that some of the materials are still from the Rhino material palette. I haven't adjusted them yet to Vray materials. I'll pause it now while this goes. Okay, so I'm going to stop this just so you can see the character of it right now, and then I'm going to move that light down into the space so that we get more of a direct application of it onto the model here, and you're going to get a better sense of how the lights really impact everything that you're looking at. So I'm going to do a move vertical and put this light down inside of the space, and now zoom back in here where we can see the model. I'm going to go ahead and while I'm here come down here and say set view and go to named views in the list of views. By going to name views here, you get this little dialog box, allows you to save different views. This is really useful for doing batch rendering. Basically, if you want to go to bed at night, you can set up a whole series of different images and just let them run at higher resolution once you have them all set up and queued up. I'll show you how that works in a second. Okay, so now by moving that light into the space, we get a much more accurate representation of both the cardboard, the glazing, the shadows, and even the wood element of the 2x4 moving up through the piece. In this case, I would probably still go back and turn down the light. So I'll come back here to the lights and the Omni light. I'm just going to take this intensity down to number 1 and then see how that starts to look. Seems like it's a bit more controlled. You can always, well, you really always have to take these into Photoshop afterwards and touch them up, add in figures and plants and all sorts of other stuff. I also find that just bringing in the 3D models of plants from SketchUp is a really useful way of testing these things out and applying some of the kind of greenery that you would want, both trees and plants, so forth. Okay, so lastly, I'll show you that batch render component. I'm going to hit stop here, and I'm going to swing around to another view. Come in here and say set view, go to named views again, hit save as again, and basically these views are going to get saved exactly as they are. And then the way to use this is that you would come back in to Vray, go to the settings once you have all the materials working how you want, and change this up to say 3000 pixels, which is going to be a much higher resolution rendering. And then instead of starting right here with the rendering, I'm going to close this window and come to just go to the drop down here, go to tools, here we go, under Vray rendering, and go to batch render. You can see it opens up another little dialog box here. I will pull this out so you can see it. You point it to the file that you've got, so it's important that you save the file. So I'm going to hit save here on this first. And then even though the file's open, we're still going to point it to that. It pulls in the views that you've got. I'm going to just select the 2 that I've created, and you could have 20 views here, and you could select them all. And then you hit start, and basically it reopens the model exactly the way it is, and then starts rendering each of the different views. And you can see here it gives you a status update of what's going on with the renderings as they go. So that's a quick little intro, quick and dirty intro to Vray. There are a lot of other things that you can do, but this at least gets it open and gets you doing some decent images quickly, both from a Revit model and from any kind of Rhino content that you would add into it. Again, don't stare at Vray. Don't waste your time. Make sure you have access to a second machine. Go use the lab machines. If you just put this on your laptop, you're going to make it so that you can't do anything else while this stuff is going on. So you need to be prepared, be organized in order to make sure that that this stuff is working well. You know, before I close, I'm just going to point out here on the 2x4 the way in which the material is oriented the wrong way. I'm going to hit stop on this and show you how to fix that, because it's an important part that I didn't really address with the metals. I mean with the materials. So I'm going to go to the wood planks here, and then down under maps, what I'm going to do first is here's the diffuse map, and you can see when there's a checkbox, that means there's a map applied. So the diffuse color is the color that you see. That's this this color right here. I'm going to hit the open, and you can see the actual image that's here. And if I go to texture placement, here I can come down and actually rotate that 90 degrees. So I'll do that, and you can see now the orientation of the planks is going the other way. I also need to apply this to the bump map. So you can see that the bump map typically will align itself, and in this case it does. It's a black and white variation of the image that starts to create the cracks and some of the texture on the material itself. Any changes that I make, this is really important, any changes that you make to the display to the diffuse color map, you also need to make those exact same changes to the bump map or any other maps that are applied to it, because typically they're going to have really similar kinds of images that are applied. So now the image and the texture are both going in the right direction. If I hit render, hopefully my 2x4 looks better in this context. Okay, that's a quick and dirty intro to V-Ray.